from, well, I know from the people who use CoverageBook and talking to people who were sort of mid-campaign a little while ago, and then the pandemic hit everybody around the world. And so things have been a little bit tricky. And some of you may well know that this is the third, this is the third webinar we have done in the last month or so, and it's all around pivoting in PR. And the reason why we've been doing that is because everyone has been affected and huge changes have happened, and we've all had to adapt. So we've covered how to adapt your sell-ins, and whether you can sell in with the same story, how to change it, to news desks, and we got some great information from news desks in the UK and US. So if you missed that one, there is a recording. You can go and check that out on the blog. We also looked at how to adjust your strategy with new insights. And that was a couple of weeks ago. And now moving on to the next stage of, things have changed. Our communications had to change. And so we now need to look at what we are measuring. And so that brings me on to welcoming our very special guest, Katie Paine, so also known as the Queen of Metrics and the Queen of Measurement. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Katie, which many people are, I first saw Katie speak a few years ago at a conference in, I think it might have been in New York maybe, but I was completely taken aback at that, how Katie can just really get into the nuts and bolts of measurement and what you need to, and the kind of metrics that you need, and how to sort of move away just from vanity metrics that everybody uses and that you might just reuse every single time, to really understanding what your objectives are and how to really truly measure that. And so Katie is she's the CEO of Paine Publishing, her business, and also runs Measurement Camp. So do check that out. She also puts out a lot of amazing content through painepublishing.com, which there's downloads and templates and tips, all sorts of, she's also the author of many books. So do check out the content through Paine Publishing, because it's been very helpful to us. And I know that Katie's helped thousands of PR people around the world with how to be better at measurement. So we are going to be looking at how we can pivot when PR has had to pivot, how to reset KPIs and adjust our measurements. So welcome, Katie. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much. And I also have, go check out our YouTube channel, because what I've started to do is record very specific things like how to create a pivot table and how to create goal conversions, because what we're finding is that, we'll get into it in a minute, but people are going to have to measure things differently, and a lot of times they don't know the nuts and bolts of it. So we're trying to do that as well.
Okay, so just a couple of house rules for everybody. I'm just going to show. So I'm going to be asking you some questions throughout at the beginning, and so there is a function which is raise your hand, so I'll come on to that shortly. If you have any questions throughout, which I'm sure you will do, add them to the Q&A section rather than the chat, and that means that we can get to them easily. We have set aside some time at the end, and we will try and answer as many of your questions as possible. If we don't get through to all of the questions, connect with us on Twitter and maybe we'll be able to cover some there, maybe. But we will try and cover as many as possible. And there are, feel free to share any of the information that you are getting through this webinar. As I mentioned, we are on Twitter. I'm at Stella Bayles. It's all on the screen right now. Also at CoverageBook. And also Katie is at Queen of Metrics. Feel free to share. Okay, well, without further ado, shall we get started? I really would like to just get a bit of a show of hands from everybody to understand who we've got in the audience. We know that people are joining us from all sorts of different places around the globe, which is fantastic, but we want to get an idea of whether you are in a not-for-profit organisation right now, or the opposite, a profit organization. So if you can show your hands if you are in a profit organization, that will give us a good idea of the audience here.
Wow.
So if you do that, and then we can have a look. So we've got, it's just, geez, it looks like it's about half and half.
Yeah.
Still going up. Okay, slowly. Okay.
Well, I'd say it's more profit than non-profit.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. It's good to see that we've got a good mix. That gives us a bit of background for when we're talking through as well. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Katie now, because we are sort of ready for our first question. And actually, yeah, it'd just be great to just get your thoughts on what kind of impact can something like this have on PR measurement? We've gone through now, we've been in this for a couple of 8 weeks, we've all been in lockdown, and we've, as I mentioned with the webinars, we've been doing changing selling in and a change in strategy now into PR measurement. What kind of impact does it have?
Well, the biggest impact is basically there's two consequences of it. We've never been, since there's been PR and the internet, we haven't really been through a change like this, where it's it's the equivalent of a world war, frankly, in terms of how people are affected all over the world. So that's number one. So whatever you were doing 8 weeks ago, your goals were different. And when your goals and objectives change, your metrics have to change. And 8 weeks ago, you were trying to sell something to somebody, and now, if you're still selling anything, it's online, which is a different audience. And if you're not selling anything, what you're trying to do is just getting people to trust you, make you feel safe, so that when they are able to go out there and shop at your store or do business with you in whatever service you have, that they feel comfortable and safe. And as I said, safe is new, unique selling proposition. I mean, it's part of the landscape, but if people don't feel safe, and there's a lot of discussion, I don't know if it's true in England, Stella, but on places like Nextdoor and neighborhood groups of what grocery store do you feel safest in? What restaurant would you be willing to go out to? So what's happening is word of mouth, friends, family who we're spending a whole lot more time with is way more important than it might have been. And as much as we are all consuming things, there's some interesting research out this morning that basically said some majority of people have tried a new brand since this all started. And the reasons for that is I couldn't get the old one, or I have more time so I can research it. And the third, which is probably the most important, is I want to buy local, right? I want to buy from a local company. And so things like that are going to change your goals and objectives. They're going to change your messages. And so, of course, all of your metrics have to change.
Mm. So can we explore that a little bit more? I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you so you can dive into some of your slides. But that would be great to have a look at that a little bit more, Katie, just to see what kind of, what do we need to change now? What do we need to measure? And whilst Katie just powers up her slides, I'm going to do another quick poll, actually. So somebody asked this in the chat. Could you show your hands if you are B2B? So we want to see an idea of whether people are B2B or consumer. People are interested in seeing that. So show your hand if you are B2B.
A lot of B2B.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. So the reality is that B2B probably hasn't had quite as much of an impact as consumer. But here's the thing: the other aspect of this is that the rules that applied for your messaging, for your communications, for your ads, all of that stuff, they're all changing, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you guys remember, but probably in the early days of this, people were still sending out like whatever stupid emails they had pre-programmed to go out. They just didn't think to like stop them. And they were, it was like cruise lines saying, come, Sandals Resort. Well, nobody's going to go to a cruise line, and the resorts were all shutting down. So just silly things like that, where what you were doing before is so different from what you're trying to do now. And even in the B2B space, what you're trying to do is hang on to customers, not necessarily get new ones, because if nobody has any money, nobody's going to spend any money. It's really all about loyalty, and and human emotions and how people feel about you, and less about the the benefits or whatever. It's really about how people feel about you. Go ahead. That's the way.
What should we do first?
I was going to say that, I mean, the thing that I want to say to everybody is that these are incredibly uncertain times. Nobody has an answer. I was just telling Stella, my neighbor just got exposed to somebody who had COVID-19. Well, I don't know what to do because I don't know whether he's got it yet, right? I mean, and everybody is approaching every single day. You don't know, how many, whether you're going to get it, if you're immune, all of these questions of, when are we going to open up? Is this open? Is that open? Can I do this? Can I do that? There's so many uncertainties. And research, data, and measurement are the answers. And so I keep saying the next normal is measurement has to be front and center, because it's the only way you're going to know. Because what are your customers feeling? I don't know. Unless you ask them, you're not going to know. So the other piece, and I said, is that people are so much more the emotional aspect of all of this stuff. It's not about people's emotions and perspectives are changing. Everybody here is from all over the world, but people are seeing the poverty and wealth gaps. They're getting angry at celebrities who are running to the Hamptons or going out on their yachts. I mean, things that we just took and brushed off are now becoming a big deal, because either we've got time to deal with it, or it just feels inappropriate. So you have to think in terms of all the things that public relations has always been good at, which is building relationships, right? Building trust, showing empathy, being authentic. All of those things are key to good public relations and always have been. It's what you do best. It's sort of time for PR to shine, and maybe get the salespeople a little bit less visible, because they're not going to be necessarily as effective at communicating. And if you look at the really effective communicators around this whole thing, it's people who are authentic and empathetic. And the way you become that is either it's either part of your culture. I mean, I love the fact that Microsoft says that empathy is the core of the company, both towards employees as well as towards the customers, because that means that empathy will be front and center. But if that's not the case in your organization, it needs to be, and therefore you have to measure it now, find out whether anybody thinks you're trustworthy or empathetic or authentic, and then you have to measure it on a regular basis going forward, because measurement gives you the answers. It tells you what you don't know, and then it tells you what you need to know. And there we go. So the other piece of this is that we've seen, at least in many countries, not all, that people who are trusting the data and the science live longer. I mean, New Zealand is held up as the example of somebody who trusted data and science, and they've sort of kicked it solve the problem first. But the biggest problem that you run into is going to be fear of finding out, right? That fofo thing out there, which is, oh God, I don't want to hear the bad news. You hear it in politicians saying, I don't want to do more tests because that's only going to bring us bad news. But there's a remarkable number of people in organizations that have the same problem. And they like what they like and they don't want to change. Well, now they're going to have to do things. Now, the good news is you can test, right? There's all kinds of ways that you can test social media programs. You can test traditional media programs. You can test anything you do in a blog, on your website or whatever. There's ways to test these, whether it's a brief survey, Google Brand Lift or Awareness Lift or whatever that is, and Facebook. Brand Lift is a simple survey that goes out to people who have seen your content. Google Surveys is a great tool to just send people out there and say, what do you think? And then you look at your goal conversions, you look at your web traffic, you look at all those things that people are going to respond with and see what's working. But you can't just sort of say, okay, we got 37,000 views. That's not the point. The point is, before, the BC times, before COVID times, we were getting this, right? Then it went down to this, and now it's going up a little bit. That matters. Look at the things that tie back to your strategic goals. And that means you're not looking necessarily at, you're certainly not looking at, add value equivalency. You're not really looking at things like column inches or impressions. You're looking at, are people responding to the stuff that I put out there? And you need to look at not things like, if you're putting videos out there, it's not enough that they clicked on it. What you want to know is, how long did they spend watching it? Did they watch 100% of it or 75% of it? That is within Google Analytics. Google can tell you that, but that's the kind of thing that you need to be looking at.
So, Katie, can I just jump in quickly? You mentioned, I've got like that BC before COVID. Should there literally be a BC line in our reporting somewhere? Because
in every report, you're going to see, I would hope that in every single report. First of all, reports have been done badly by many people for many years because they like pie charts, which drive me crazy. You always want to look at things over time. And in any situation, the COVID times are going to be different because, first of all, it used to be back in the day when we actually, had clips, there's a news hole and you only had so much, space to get in. And we would see that around the Olympics and around presidential things, our coverage would go down for our clients because we were doing, sort of similar to CoverageBook back then, where we were, looking at the volume of coverage and the tone, blah, blah, blah. But the volume would always go down around major news things. Well, now it's even worse because there is no other news. There's just so much stuff going on out there that if you don't have a COVID angle to your story, it is really hard to get any coverage at all. And I highlighted, it's our newsletter comes out next week, and I strongly recommend people check it out because we're going to use some examples. Michigan State University is a client of mine, and I'm just sort of helping them do their measurement stuff. But as part of it, I signed up for the daily newsletter, and their daily newsletter always features an expert at MSU talking about something really useful, whether it is, what is contact testing and how do you do it? Or whether it is, what's the truth about all of this vaccine stuff? Now they have expertise, but what that's doing is getting their expertise out there in a positive way that is really relevant. And, presumably they're going to look at that newsletter, count the open rate and the click-through rate, and say, okay, which of these stories is resonating the most with people, so let's do more of those. And I have to believe they must have done that someplace a month ago because they're very consistent about having really useful information. In contrast, a PR services firm, not exactly a competitor, but one that's been around for a while, put out an email today, and it had absolutely nothing to do with COVID. It had not. It may actually have good information in there. It was like, oh, what's the top media outlet, and what's the top this, and what's the top that. And it was like a list of best of. Might have been very good information, but in this email there were 6 headlines, not one of which was relevant to what I cared about. And I'm in the business, right? I read this stuff all the time, and I couldn't find a reason to click on anything. So it's the reason why people are going to click on your articles, click on your content, is because you've touched a nerve. And this is where we've got to get rid of the idea that you can measure everything in clicks and hits, and accept the idea that you're going to have to measure feelings and perceptions. So that's what in answer to this question, what should we do first? Some form of survey research to figure out how your stakeholders are feeling. And especially if you've got employees that are working from home, and it might be the first time that they're working from home, you need to check in with them, because they could be perfectly fine on 97 Zoom calls. And the moment you get off the Zoom call, they're looking for another job, or they're changing careers. I mean, people are really taking time to rethink their lives these days. I had a chat with a friend yesterday, and she's a rising star in the airport management world, and she's thinking about joining the Air Force. People are making very big life choices these days because their lives have been so disrupted. So you really have to get a good handle on what your employees, as well as your customers and other stakeholders, are doing. Feeling.
So how do we understand? How do we measure feelings?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is you've got to think in terms of measuring on a continuum, right? So if I ask, I'm going to get to, so you can ask, questions of your employees or of your stakeholders, right? How do you feel about this? I mean, if you've been sending out informational messages, you don't ask them, have you heard X, Y, and Z, or have you read X, Y, and Z? It is, name a priority, right? Or pick a priority out of a list, and you throw in some fake ones to make sure that they're paying attention. The other thing is that in times of crisis and stress, when everybody is like sort of both overwhelmed with news and turned off by the news, in order to get them to do what you want them to do, specifically, let's talk about employees. So you want employees to be, safe, act safely, come back to work, do all these things. They have to see what's in it for them. They have to believe that they have the ability to do it. So you might want to ask them, if you came into work, not just would you feel safe, but do you have the ability to maintain distances in your job? Can you do these things? And then they have to have the confidence to know that what you're telling them to do is going to help them, right? So there's those 3 aspects. You need to ask like some tough questions, like, what do you hate about me? Or what do you hate about our messages? Or what don't you like about this event, or whatever? Have you changed? Be prepared for bad news. What's more important to you? Speed, or the fact that you're local, that you're a local supply chain, and I'm not getting anything from China anymore. I want to get something local. Maybe what matters the most to them is the fact that you're right down the road, or that you're a day's trucking away. And then ask them, what do they need, right? Can you meet those needs with a new product or service? Can you do something completely different? I mean, I think, on micro scale, it was all the restaurants saying, yes, we can do takeout, but can your business do something similar? I love the fact that there's I think it's a car dealership. It's either a car, and it's not a car. Maybe it's anyway, some movie theater related company around here has a huge parking lot, and he's turning it into a drive-in, right? That kind of flip is what's required to get your messages out there, have it stand out, and also be successful.
This the feedback that you get from this kind of research is really going to, it's more than just here's the PR campaign we did this quarter. I mean, this is really going to save a business or an organization or not, really, isn't it? It's just super important, more than ever, to have this kind of data and feeding it into the right people within the business, isn't it, or organization?
Yeah. Well, and even if you're looking at media, right? What you want to be looking at in your media isn't how many impressions you made, but rather, does your media coverage convey the positioning, right? If you want to be known as an empathetic company, or if you want to be known as a company who has changed and, had an aha moment and now treats its employees better, or whatever you're trying to get across, you need to be looking at your media coverage for those complicated issues. And that means that you're going to have to read it. You're not going to be able to, I mean, there are programs out there that are AI based. They're getting a lot closer to being able to figure out things like, do I have a potential crisis brewing here, and how should I respond to that crisis? And there's a story about that in my newsletter too. But the point is the fact that it's how people are talking about you is so much more important right now than whether they're talking about you. Because to a certain extent, you don't want them to be talking about you. Imagine the poor people at Lysol and Clorox and the Lysol guys were in England, they were having dinner, right? And all of a sudden you're like front page news and, Lysol is trending on Twitter. I mean, that's your worst nightmare. But that's the kind of thing that can happen. And so what you want to make sure is that, are you still making progress against your goals? And in the process, are you building trust, empathy, credibility?
Mm. And I guess what the new goals are as well, that BC mark in measurement, goals before, goals after.
And the other thing is I think you need a measure to measure the crisis avoided. I mean, this is the big deal, is the fact that you guys out there, PR people, are, they're at their best when there is no news, when whatever you think is going to happen doesn't happen, right? So, and that comes up a lot in conversations right now, which is, how do I measure the fact that we didn't get any coverage for this potential disaster? And the answer is there's sort of three basic ways. Did I put a slide in here for that? No. Okay. The first way is you have a measurement system in place. You have a way of knowing how big a crisis or not, this happens. So in other words, if you've had crises in the past, right, and you got, 100 negative stories, and now you're quashing a crisis and you got 2 negative stories, that's a measure that you can compare. You've got a benchmark from a previous crisis that you can compare yourself to. Or you look at a competitor or a peer organization and say, okay, they did have this crisis, I did not. Let's compare their coverage to ours, right? Survey your people and say, is this a crisis to you? So many people think that things are a crisis when in fact the public perception is not. I mean, I've seen, I've been deep in the weeds of a media analysis looking at negative coverage and realizing, yeah, I can see how come either the computer or an analyst or somebody thought this was negative, but is it really? And then you'll go to the web traffic and say, no, I actually generated 27 million new users of your website. For a nonprofit I was working with, it literally told me his worst nightmare story, and it was like just awful late night television joke, worst thing you could imagine. And then it turns out that within the next 24 hours, they got a 20% increase in subscriptions and donations and members to their nonprofit site. So is it really a crisis should be your first question. And then look at it and say, okay, there's a blip, but it's not as big a blip as those guys over there had. It's not as big a blip as we used to have. So crisis and risk measurement are two huge things. I was thinking today, I don't know if anybody is here from Michigan. I'm so sorry. I hope you're safe. But Dow Chemical's plant is right there in the middle of all these floods. And all of a sudden it goes from it's a weather thing to, oh my God, there's a potential chemical crisis. So now there's risk communications. And I, have to say that the Dow response of, the mayor saying Dow's a good partner and Dow saying, we've done X, Y, Z and this, that, and that, and the long list of things that they've done. And I'm like, somebody wrote a good crisis communications plan there because they were doing pretty much what they needed to do.
So, you've got to go on
Yeah,
to.
let's just say, so here's my big aha moment in all of this stuff. Traditionally, public relations and communications professionals have produced a dashboard like this. And the bar, everything's over time. And, maybe there's a line for, net positivity or something in volume or whatever. And that's your PR chart on a dashboard. And then you have one for social media, and then you have one for digital media, and maybe you have one for internal comms or whatever. You have all these little windows into different activities. Throw that dashboard out the window, because what really matters right now is your strategic priorities. And so in this case, what you've got is 6 strategic priorities: community development and education and payments or whatever. And so each one of those is a high priority for your organization, right? This is what the organization knows it has to do in order to survive the next 2 years while we're trying to figure out a vaccine, and while the recession hits or depression hits or whatever, while we try to, build back up. There are going to be priorities for every single one of you, right? So you're going to go to senior leadership and say, okay, hopefully there's no more than 6, right? What are the 6, 5, 4, 3, small numbers, hopefully, priorities that we have to contribute to? And then for each priority, your team, if you're just doing PR, then meet with social, meet with digital, meet with employees, meet with events. Everybody figure out the connection between what it is you are doing and that goal. Now, this is an example from an organization whose goal it is to be seen as the go-to credible source for economic information. So I use this because credibility is the core of what they're trying to do. So they produce content, right? Digital, web, email, traditional media, whatever they do, they produce content. It goes out to the right people. So one of their metrics is, am I reaching my top tier media, my influencers, the right government officials? Gets to them, you ask them, did you get it? Do they do anything with it? You watch their activities. And then you say, okay, well, if they feel I'm credible, what would if you find something credible, what do you do with it, right? Well, you might subscribe to their newsletter. You might frequently go to their site and download stuff. You might download more information, right? You might share it or quote it or amplify it, right? All those are signs of credibility. So what you've got here is a bunch of different activities on one side, all flowing through to credibility. Each one of these is measurable. And then you have a picture of, here's how my entire department is contributing to credibility.
Yeah.
right? And same thing with trust, or same thing with, leads, or whatever it is that the priorities are. But that's essentially how you do it, is you work it out with senior leadership, how all the different things that we do contribute to the strategic goal. And then everybody gets their metric in there, but you're reporting as a single contribution to a bigger picture, because that's the value to the CEO and your board and the people out there that really matter and sign your paychecks and decide whether you're going to be laid off or somebody else is going to get laid off.
So I can see that the layout was made really, really clear, and how the metrics can start to build at each point there. So there was like a download, there's whether they then went to the site, did they then share it? You can start to build up a picture of the kind of metrics that you could pull together. Trust, you've mentioned, and it's obviously like going to be so important, especially moving from now and forward, probably for quite some time. How do you measure trust? I mean,
Actually, it's been done for a long time. And the good news is that back in the, oh God, I want to say the recession, it was back in the Enron crisis. And I was asked to write a white paper along with the Institute for Public Relations and a bunch of academics on how to restore trust. So the good news is that a wonderful professor named James Brunig essentially worked with me on that. He had done a bunch of things on how to measure relationships. Within his work, there's a lot of work around trust, and he identified certain aspects of trust. So you ask people certain questions. The first thing is this goes back to, why are people going to listen to you? First of all, they need to believe that you can help them, right? So they need to know that you're credible, right? That they need your information because you're a trustworthy source. They need to know that there's some benefit to them, not just to you. And they need to believe that there's a downside, right, to not paying attention to you. So what Professor Grunig did was to come up with something like 79 statements, and they all roll up into trust. Now, if you look on the right side of this chart, right, trust is made up of a belief that you're competent, that you have integrity, you're dependable, reliable, transparency, you're transparent, vulnerability, that you're human, authentic, that you have concern for your employees, that I can identify with you. I feel like I have some control over you as much as you have control over me. Satisfaction with the relationship, commitment. There's a lot of downside statements that say things like, this company only deals with me when they think it can make a profit. Nobody ever dares ask that question. If anybody in this call would ever ask that question, please, I will, give you, I don't know, free tickets to anything. Case of champagne, anything, because nobody ever asks the hard questions. But just looking at the positive statements, what you're doing is you're saying, do you agree on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7? To what extent do you agree or disagree with statements like this? Sound principles seem to guide this organization's behavior, right? That's integrity. This organization can be relied upon to keep its promises. Dependability, reliability. I feel confident about the skills, right? That's competence. This organization has the ability to accomplish what it says it will do. This organization does not mislead people like me. This organization is known to be successful at the things it tries to do. Now, those are just a sample. You can use 3 of them, 5 of them, 6 of them, 79 of them. I don't care how many you use. But what you do is you look at, you survey a sample of your population, and say you're surveying, 500 people, and half of them say, are strongly inclined to agree with this thing. They either agree or strongly agree. So that's, 50%. and you average all the 50, you average all the results, and you actually have a trust score that you can then use to keep track of your trust over time. I mean, you don't have to develop a score, but that's, it's a trust index is kind of a handy thing to do. You can also look for concepts like this in your media coverage, right? So you can, and I've done it. It's not perfect. You can't really automate it, but you can certainly read your coverage, review your coverage, analyze your coverage to determine whether, in fact, it contains any of these concepts. And what I would highly recommend doing is doing that, and also looking at either what press releases or what topics or what issues generate a high level of trust. Because a lot of times you will learn things. What was fascinating, we did an analysis for a celebrity who wanted us to measure trust for him. And it turned out that his work on the environment and his work on the veterans were, boosted trust more than anything else. And then, but most of his tweets and everything else had to do with animals. And because one of his favorite animals was a squirrel, and there's a lot of controversy about squirrels, especially among bird lovers, that did not yield any trust. But his wedding did. So, I mean, it's like you need to figure out what kind of things are enhancing your trust and what things are not.
Especially when there's going to be a big change in activity happening right now. You can sort of see how these questions could fit with those different points of activity that he shows on the outline.
Yeah, and what you can do, I mean, you can put them in Google surveys. You can ask people if you're having virtual events like this. You could ask them at the end of an event, please answer these questions, and it gives you a sense of whether people believe you or not.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of different tools there. Are there any other tools that you
Oh yeah. So this is your new toolbox. Make sure Answer the Public is one of my new favorite tools. I know it's been around for a while, and I know you're associated with it. I've loved CoverageBook for a long time, but Answer the Public is a great way to find out what questions you are associated. I mean, in other words, how are people asking questions? So for instance, if you ask a question, what were we doing yesterday about universities? Where's a college nearby that specializes in engineering? And it gives you all the variations of that questions, and it's tremendously useful for you to understand how people are looking for you. So that one of the most important pieces now is people need to find you. People are online all the time trying to find solutions, and you need to be right up there. So your search engine rank and making sure that your press releases and the words that you use out there are aligned with how people are trying to find things. So search engine optimization, things like Answer the Public to find out how people are thinking about things, Google Forms, pivot tables. Can't live without pivot tables. Pivot tables are going to tell you, all the hidden aha and insights behind all of your media coverage. Goal conversions in Google Analytics. We use Google Data Studio, which happens to be free to create dashboards. These are the kinds of things you need. I mean, yes, it's important to monitor your coverage and have social listening, all the rest of that stuff, but it doesn't mean anything unless you know how people are feeling, unless you can analyze it with some depth, and unless you understand how people are responding to it. I mean, that's the beauty of Google Analytics, is that when something goes out there, are people responding, and how are they responding?
Just for people who aren't aware of Answer the Public, so as everyone will know, it's hosted by CoverageBook, but we also do have another tool which is Answer the Public, and I wasn't expecting Katie to include it, so it wasn't like we were pushing it at all, but it is actually really useful. And we've got a new, just to give you a bit of background, it brings in all of the questions that billions of people every day are putting into Google. Then that's probably even higher right now. So it could be about absolutely anything. You put the topic in and it will pull back all of those different questions around that topic. And something that's going to be going live for, it's a free tool, by the way, but there is a paid version. And in the paid version, there's going to be an alert system to when those questions start to change. So you can imagine if you are tracking reputation and crisis around your organization at the moment, that could be really handy. So
well, I mean, for instance, the interesting thing is it used to be that people would go into Google and say things like best webcam, right? And they might go to Google Shopping and find it. Now the questions are much longer because they are doing this. Siri, what's the best webcam for Zoom videos?
Here are some videos of webcam for Zoom I found on the web.
And Answer the Public pulls out those longer questions. And it's really important. So in other words, if you're trying to optimize a press release, it's important to look at those other words that people are using in their searches that they weren't using before. I mean, we talked about this for an hour and a half on Tuesday with my measurement camp folks. The importance of search in your success now cannot be overestimated. I mean, it's just you cannot, underestimate. It is seriously how people are going to find you going forward more than ever, especially if we're all online and working from home and everything else. And so it's a really optimizing your press releases around being found. All of that stuff is incredibly important.
If that is new for, it's actually before I started working in technology, I was doing SEO and PR together. So have some experience there, but I know that it's quite a new area for a lot of people in public relations. So if that is you, just try and find out who within your organization or your client's organization is looking at it and make friends with them right now. I was going to say take them out for lunch. We won't be able to do that, but be a very good friend over Zoom, and also educate yourself where possible. I've actually got I'm giving away my book that's all about SEO, PR, like an introduction to it for free at the moment. So I'll send a link afterwards.
Send a link, because I have clients that are using their rank in Google search as a metric of their success.
Yeah, it's very important. Great. So we've got 10 minutes left. Is there? We had a couple of questions come through from the attendees, but is there anything else that you wanted to add? In fact, I have a quick question. Sorry to jump ahead of the attendees, but so I really liked the outline that you showed of those different points where you will either be working sort of alone or with other departments in the organisation, and putting together those metrics for each of the
that one.
Yeah. So looking at the toolbox now, would we be placing some of these, I guess, like the survey one that you had, that would be at the front, like would you sort of plot those? Is it a good idea to start plotting the tools that we need, or would it differ for different types of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at, shares are clearly in your Google Analytics and in your amplification of, it's actually more in the amplification of your news stuff. Quotes are going to be in your media coverage already, but things like downloads and subscriptions and stuff like that, those are all going to come from, your mails, your email server or your website. In this case, what this particular client did, and it's not on this chart because they already had it in place, was, I don't know what they're doing now, but after every time they had an interaction, whether it was a small meeting or an event or anything else with their key stakeholders, they would ask those trust questions. And so every event that they did ended up with a trust score.
Right.
Now, whether they were using Google Forms or surveys or SurveyMonkey or whatever. I don't know anymore, but I know that they were using SurveyMonkey at one point. But yeah, so that's why all those tools all map back to one or more of these things you need to know.
Okay, so if you have, okay, we've got a couple of questions. Georgie Ravenscroft has asked, which social media tools would you recommend for analysing content performance and audience on Instagram, Facebook in particular, not Twitter? Are there any social media tools that you recommend?
To me, I mean, I hate to say this, but they're all sort of the same. I mean, because I mean, the key is the extent to which, the extent of the health of their relationship with Twitter and Facebook. Because I mean, everything depends upon the extent to which, Facebook/Instagram/whatever, is granting you access to their data. Now, some of them, first of all, I don't think you should be looking at social media separate from your traditional media anyway. Because, I mean, if you look at especially now when you've got so many media outlets in trouble, and so these journalists that have been following you for years may or may not have a news outlet attached to them, but they're still going to write blog posts about you, and they're still going to tweet about you, and they're still going to investigate you. And it's so much today is so much more about specific authors than it is about specific media outlets. So tracking those authors on their Twitter accounts, because they're going to put everything on Twitter anyway, their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, their LinkedIn accounts, as well as whatever they do wherever it shows up, is really the way you need to look at it, because those writers, those human beings that are generating stories about you, they're the ones that are going to influence your audiences.
That actually came up as quite an important point on the Selling In webinar that we did. The fact that, especially because news desks, just the structure and organisation has changed so much during this time, that that you just got to follow the authors rather than because obviously there's nobody on the news desk anymore. You can't just phone a news desk like you used to, so it is much more about just in particular the authors, and apparently they are wanting people to be in touch with them more generally. I know everyone's different, but generally on Twitter, just doing their communications through Twitter. So that's coming up. Somebody did just Beck's message to say that she recommended Pulsar as a great social web listening tool. Thank you. There's loads out there. I don't know whether Georgie meant mentions on social media or if it's owned. If it's owned, I know that all of the platforms have amazing analytics now if it's your owned posts, but if you're talking about mentions, then as Katie said, they're all quite similar. There's great ones out there for monitoring, but they are quite similar.
Well, and the other thing is, there really are only two things, right? There's the stuff you pay for, which is owned. Basically, if you have a social media person in house, you're paying them, him or her. So you paid for that. And so your own stuff is paid, and just as you place ads in Google or anything else, it's paid. On the other hand, you got the earned stuff, which happens in social and traditional and, word of mouth and all the rest of that stuff. So think in terms of really, there's just two things. There's the stuff you hope to earn, including shares, because shares are things that you earn because you're credible enough to do them. And then all the stuff that you have to pay for. And that's really all there is. So Peso is a lovely model, but it's a little over expanded than it needs to be, I think.
Yeah. So Lucy Jenna Brown has just asked, do you have any advice for a PR working on smaller consumer brands and the best ways of measuring, especially because funds aren't there right now to be able to cover customer surveys?
Well, customer surveys can be done for free. I mean, that's the point, is the fact that they don't have to cost $100,000 because, you can send out up to 10 questions on Google surveys or however. I mean, you've got a lot of companies, and I think Google does it this way too, but Surveyta does it, where you're just paying responses. You want responses, it's going to be $5, right? I mean, it doesn't cost you a fortune to get that in. But more importantly, for brands, I think what you want to do is tie things to, you want to as much as you can. So either use goal conversions and say, okay, I've got tags in everything I'm doing, and those tags say PR in them somewhere. And so that when somebody goes to your website and either subscribes or buys something or signs up or does something that you want them to do, as in an event or a goal conversion in Google, that comes back to you. And that's going to be a much more valuable metric. I mean, Steakums is a perfect example, because Steakums, got a lot of publicity for being a sort of data geek in the middle of all of this stuff. And, yes, it's a frozen shaved steak company that I remember in the 70s. It was great. I loved it. Hadn't thought about it in a million years. Neither had a whole lot of other people. But guess what? They started tweeting this stuff about data and the importance of science and the importance of listening to data scientists, et cetera. And it was very esoteric, but beautifully written. 2 weeks later, they were sold out in all the grocery stores, right? That's the kind of measure you want, right? You want a mechanism that says, okay, nobody's doing any other advertising right now, because what's the point? So we're doing this crazy stuff on Twitter, and guess what? Sales spiked. The more you can tie stuff to your business and to revenue, the more likely it is you will have a job in 2021.
Yeah. Yes.
Not to be overly dramatic, but everybody, that's the other thing, is your whether it's social media or traditional media or whatever the heck it is, look at it from a cost efficiency standpoint. How many downloads did you get? How many conversions did you get? How many leads did you get? Whatever that happens to be, put a dollar cent in there. So in other words, if it costs you $1,000 to get, 100 hits and, generate 3 leads, how does that compare to having to pay for television advertising? I mean, I'm not talking about add value equivalency, because that's a very different thing. What we're talking about is cost efficiency. What does it cost to actually generate a lead via PR versus a lead versus paid advertising?
Yeah.
Or a very expensive event. That's what I think is going to kill in-person events, is the fact that people are finding that they're doing as well with online events. I heard there's a great piece out this morning about somebody who, instead of doing sales calls, would set up a call on Zoom and then send them a pizza, so they were both eating pizza at the same time, or a bottle of rosé or whatever it was. And so you have events, but if it costs $50 to send a pizza and a bottle of rosé, that's still a hell of a lot cheaper than getting on a plane and, or driving to somebody or flying to somebody's location. So I think a lot of events are going to go ahead.
For sure. We've actually we've run out of time.
Oh dear.
Gone very quickly. But I would quite like to just ask one more question, if people are happy to stay on, because we've still got people here. I think one more question we'll squeeze in, and then we will tie it up. Somebody... I wanted to squeeze this one in because it's from Beatrice, who is in a PR agency, and she has asked what is the most important element of measurement that they should be thinking about right now in regards to client campaigns. I did ask what kind of clients, but I'm not sure she's come back yet. Beatrice, if you're still here, let us know what kind of clients, because I guess that's going to be really important. Is it the same? Would it be exactly the same, or would it be different? Because I know that you talked about sort of surveying customers. If your agency side
I think, I mean, I think I know it's harder for agencies to survey customers because sometimes they can't get access to that stuff, but you can certainly survey the marketplace, right? I mean, not actual customers, but you can certainly do a survey of the marketplace to find out what their needs are and whether they trust, what brands they trust. And I don't think you could, as some of these questions have to do with, can you ignore COVID? No, you can't. I mean, it's not that you should have a COVID campaign, but you can't pretend it doesn't happen, and nor can you sound like everybody else, right? I mean, if I hear one more brand saying, we're very concerned about your safety and we're taking all precautions, I don't care. I assume that is table stakes, right? Of course you're going to. If you're not, then, tell me that and I'll, avoid you. But I mean, it's like you've got to make it relevant to your specific audience. And, I'm a lady of a certain age who has a very different perspective on the world than somebody in their 30s. And I think you need to understand what those differences are relative to credibility and trust in whoever you're trying to sell to.
Yeah, it's really important.
And I think there's one thing in here about it's important to have other stakeholders. Yes, the most important, it's not even just stakeholders, it's the fact that you've got to, I think you have to get finance, sales, market research, anybody else in your organization who has data involved, because you can't operate alone. There's too many different variables going on right now. So you need to understand what the financial impacts are, what's going on with sales, what's going on with customer preference. If you've got an NPS score thing going on, you need to understand that. Anybody who's got data should be brought into your measurement discussion.
And I think based on the advice that you've been giving, Katie, throughout, I think it's worth mentioning that we did do a webinar about sort of bringing new data, audience data into your strategy. And we did go into Answer the Public in a bit more detail there, which Katie has recommended. So I will include the link to that recording in the follow-up email as well, because I think it could be helpful with the things that we've been talking about.
One other thing from Signal AI in London is there's two things. One is if you are building trust, right? Let's just say that your metric is to build your trust credibility. And if you are doing that as part of a generalized campaign, you are not necessarily going, unless you can ask, where did you hear this information? If you are putting out a particular piece of information, you can ask in a survey, where did you hear it? Or did you see news about this brand recently? And then you can compare the answers from the people who've seen your news on trust to the people who haven't seen your news on trust, right? You can do that in a survey. To a certain extent, it matters less, because what really matters is overall, you've got to be thinking in terms of your whole company. And you can say, okay, I got this activity done. I got this message out there for less money than anybody else did. That's going to be valuable. But overall, what you want to be doing is building your credibility and empathy and trust. And that you may not be able to just isolate it to a press release. You're going to be able to say, hey, communications as a function did this. And this is where you've got to work backwards from. The goal is increase trust. Communications as a function, increase trust. I did it by putting out content that was shared, that was downloaded, that was, tagged with PR to complete a goal.
We are running right over now, so the last one. But actually, it would be great, Katie, if you could just pop to the end of the slides with the information of how people can connect with you and get to your newsletter as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That would be excellent.
And in the meantime, somebody has asked, besides tone in stories, how do you quantify the coverage that's on message? I know that you did have in your toolbox pivot tables, and I've seen you go through that kind of stuff in a bit more detail. So
what you do is you look at you work with your marketing team and your sales team and everybody else, and you have this conversation that says, in a story, if it contains this message, this desirable visual, it leaves people more likely to buy the product, and it quotes an influencer, right? It's a perfect 10. And if it doesn't do any of those things, and in fact has a terrible visual and a bunch of other stuff, it's a perfect nightmare. That's a -10. And you develop your own quality score. And that quality score is going to vary. There's 163 people out there. That's going to be different for all 163 of them, because quality means different things, but you can define quality. And yes, human beings are going to have to do this. This is not something you're just going to turn, but you're going to look at your single most influential authors, maybe, 50 articles a month, maybe 500 articles a month, depending upon the size of your brand. But you're going to look at this stuff and you're going to analyze it, and you're going to develop a quality score, and you're going to analyze each article for quality. And that's going to tell you how good your coverage is. You're going to define specific definitions for good coverage and bad coverage. And that way, nobody's going to be able to say, hey, we're really getting our butts kicked out there. The coverage is awful. You've got an answer. The answer is the fact that, well, in fact, 37% of it has quality score above 8, and therefore you're wrong. But go to my YouTube page, Paine Publishing's YouTube channel, and there's a whole thing on quality scores.
Yeah, I've seen Katie speak about quality scores in actually it was a part of the workshop, wasn't it, our measurement boot camp, and it was so useful. Yeah, really, really useful. And I've spent a long time in measurement, and I was just like, okay, that's exactly what I need. So yeah, really
so if people really want to get down the weeds in this, we're going to start a whole nother round of measurement camp in July. So get in touch, because I'll teach you how to do pivot tables and quality scores and create your own dashboard and create a survey. It's a 6-week course, and we get down into the weeds.
There you go. All right, we have run over quite some time, so thank you for those who have stayed with us. I think what I've taken from this is that there's no shortcuts here. You need to do this properly, because it's more important than ever to be measuring. It's not just about success of how many pieces of coverage we've got. It's about how you are understanding, building trust, and really expressing empathy with our audiences. So everything that Katie's gone through is just like so important that we do this, because it literally can mean the life or death of a business or an organization. So put the time in, I guess, with this. Katie, is there anything you want to share? Anything more? Or?
No, but can you keep it open enough, and I'll answer all the rest of the questions that we didn't get to.
Right. Well, for everybody else, thank you so much for joining. You have to be careful with that, Katie. You might get some more coming through.
That's okay. I can answer questions all day long. I love it.
Okay. Well, we will be closing this up shortly. So Katie's going to answer those questions. And if you have any more, feel free to email us. So Katie is measurementqueen@gmail.com. She is also Queen of Metrics on Twitter. And anything you have for me, there's quite a few people asking about a recording. Yes, this time tomorrow, you will all receive an email with the recording and also the slide deck as well. And I'm going to drop in the link to the past webinar that I mentioned about strategy as well. And yeah, if you want to connect with me to ask me any questions, I'm Stella@CoverageBook.com, and also Stella Bayles on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you all so much for joining from all of your different places. It's been great to have you all. And thank you, Katie, for sharing your wisdom as ever.